Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you watch this. Welcome to this new episode of Open Tech Will Save Us, in which we try to understand the social impact of software and on how open source can make it more positive. Our focus today is going to be on open standards and beyond. We will see that open standards can bring solutions, but they can also bring their fair share of questions. To discuss the matter today, we have three high-quality guests. Italo is a member of the Document Foundation, the home of the Libreoffice project. We will start the discussion with the OpenDocument format and see where this brings us. Next guest is Jean-Marc, a contributor and member of the board of the Openstreetmap Foundation. Our focus will be on a topic that requires open standards but goes beyond that. We will discuss open data. Finally, Hookshot will give us an illustration of how open standards can be used to deliver value to a project by demonstrating Hookshot, the multi-purpose bridge. Let's get started. Good evening, Italo. Can you introduce yourself and the Document Foundation? And you might be muted, Italo. Hold on, Italo. It looks like there is a sound issue. I'm going just to do a little something. Here, and I'm going to add audio input capture. I'm sorry for that. And hope that, okay. The joys of live streaming. Okay. Can you say something, and we will see if the chat can hear us?
Just talking about LibreOffice and its open standard document format. Is that okay?
Let's wait for some people in the room to confirm. Okay, excellent. We have audio from you.
Okay, so I just quickly, we created the LibreOffice project back in 2010, and when there was a risk for OpenOffice to be abandoned after Sun's acquisition by Oracle. What is specific of LibreOffice and relevant for tonight is the fact that LibreOffice is using a standard document format, which is an open standard, and in addition is the only standard or the only true or real standard available on the market. The format is called OpenDocument format. It was born in around 2005, based on the format of OpenOffice, but it was not the format of OpenOffice. What happened is that several companies gathered under the Oasis umbrella, and Oasis is an organization for the enhancement of standards. So they gather under Oasis umbrella to create a document standard which was developed for interoperability. So what they did at the time They looked at the existing standards which were relevant for documents. For instance, the first one, which is trivial, is the calendar. So the standard used for documents is the Gregorian calendar. May look funny, but that is the reality. Then you have standard colors, which are defined by tables, and so it's you don't have to, if you use these colors, you don't have to reinvent the standard. Then you have language codes, and language codes, of course, help people to deploy the language for the user interface, the vocabulary, or whatever is relevant for doing spell checking, for using the interface in their native language, and all this kind of stuff. So they looked at this, and of course there are other standards which are less common for users, like a standard for forms. So to create modules that can be filled by the user, there is the Xform standard and so on. But just to avoid entering into too technical details, these people looked at the standards and made a list of the standard that could be reused. So they implemented this standard on the format, and they developed, based on the OpenOffice format, what was missing. The first concept was to develop a standard that was based on a standard. So it was the XML markup language was chosen as the way of representing the document to the computer. Of course, when you look at the document on your screen, the computer is not just, you cannot tell the computer just put on the screen the word Italo. You have to give the computer tags, positions that allow the computer to represent on the screen what the user is entering with the keyboard or with other means of other input means. So of course they chose XML because XML was already recognized as a standard way of representing contents. So based on putting together existing standards and developing a user-friendly version of XML, where text is text, body is body, header is header, and whatever. Of course, then you have tags which start to become more complicated, because maybe you have a table, and you have a table within a table, and so on and so forth. So a document can be an extremely complex code to describe. But let's say that they tried, and in my opinion they succeeded in creating something that even a non-technical user could understand after a short introduction. And this was standardized by ISO in 2006. What happened? It happened a tragedy for Microsoft. It was not a tragedy for the users, that Massachusetts was the first to take the standard and say, we want to use ODF as a standard for all the document of the Massachusetts state. And unfortunately for Massachusetts, they are in the United States, which is also the country where Microsoft is based. So what happened is that Microsoft decided to develop their own competitive standard, because of course they didn't want Massachusetts to use ODF, which was not their format, was a standard, but was completely different from Microsoft formats. So there is a long story. There are books written on this, what happened. And it happened that in 2007, 8, a non-standard by Microsoft was approved by ISO. Why I say a non-standard? Because Office OpenXML, which is declared by Microsoft as a standard, is not a standard by any mean. So even the version that has been approved contains parts which cannot be part of a standard. But the major issue is that the non-standard was approved in two different versions. One version, which is called transitional, was supposed to stay in the market for 2 years. It's now 15 years, and it's the format created by Microsoft Office. And this is not standard declared by ISO. So ISO says Office OpenXML transitional is not a standard. It's just a bridge to allow Microsoft to let's say, to drive users to the standard. And then there is Office OpenXML strict, which again contains part which cannot be a standard. For instance, Microsoft does not recognize the Gregorian calendar. Chinese people, Muslim people, although they, for their religion, they use a different calendar, but for business, they recognize the Gregorian calendar. Microsoft recognize a funny Gregorian calendar where there is a day which has never existed, which is February 29, 1900. So Excel still consider that day as a real day. And to be compatible with Excel, we have to introduce an error on our spreadsheets, which is fantastic. So we make our spreadsheet intentionally incompatible with the Gregorian calendar to be compatible with Excel. In addition, they have recreated some language code. They have invented new colors. So anyway, I have an 8-hour presentation on the issues of Office OpenXML, which is not the case to use tonight, but it's real fun. I mean, the problem is that the users, or 99.999999% of Microsoft Office users, are convinced, because this is what Microsoft tells them, that they are using a standard. And this creates a huge interoperability issue, not only for the users that are using a real standard, but also for Microsoft users, because the version of a Microsoft Office document on the desktop is different from the version of a Microsoft Office document on the cloud, is different from a Microsoft Office mobile document, because they use a different engine for each platform. So it's a real mess. This creates huge cost for the industry, for the users. Users lose their data. I think that we all know Microsoft Office users that have lost at least one document during their life, and the document was unrecoverable in any way. And this is the unfortunate situation in the market. There are countries, especially in Europe, that have standardized on ODF. UK is the first one, but also France, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands. The problem is that politicians, because Microsoft, let's say, tries to do some lobbying with them, just a tiny bit. They spend only in Brussels $6 million per year to do lobby. It's to invite to dinners, of course. It's just to invite to dinners. So they because of this situation, there are no sanctions for people using the non-standard, and this creates issues to left and right for users. So it's unfortunately standards help people. We all know them. I mean, when people know in Italy, and not only in Italy but especially in Italy, people say, "Oh, you always talk about standards," and it's like an old guy that has just starting to have senile dementia and just repeating the same story on standards. And so I make some examples, like, for instance, imagine that there was not a petrol standard for your car. You go to a petrol station and you ask to the guy, "Can I please see the chemical analysis of your petrol, because I have to see if this is compatible with my engine"? Could you imagine this kind of... It's just ridiculous. So the problem is that hardware standard help us, because you stick to the standard because you don't have any way of doing it. If you people all the people remember when each mobile phone had a different adapter, and it was a mess. Anyone, by the way, has the Nokia adapter? Because I forgot mine. Today you are reduced to 2/3 because you have a USB and USB-C. But anyway, there are cables that allow you to get the same the adapter for any phone, and it's easy. So hardware standards are easy because you see them. Software standards, unfortunately, are a lot more complicated because the user doesn't see the standard. And as the user doesn't see the standard, they don't understand the importance and the relevance of the standard and how the standard protects them. So that's my introduction. If you want, it was a little bit of everything in a short time.
Yes, and that's exactly what I asked. It was a good introduction. You touched on many topics, and several of them are of particular interest to me. If I can start with the first question, which is a bit of a provocateur one, could we describe LibreOffice as the free edition of Microsoft Office?
No, we should describe Microsoft Office as the paying edition of LibreOffice, because LibreOffice first product, Writer, was developed 1 year before Microsoft Word. So if there's someone that has copied, it's Microsoft that has copied Star Writer, that was announced was ready in late 83, when Marco Börries, a German student, developed the software to write his thesis. So if someone has copied, but I don't think that no one has copied no one in this case, because one was developed on the west coast of the east coast of the United States, the west coast of the United States, the other in North Germany. So there was no chance at the time of being influenced. But they are two completely different products. The main difference is that LibreOffice has a common engine for all the versions. So and we call this LibreOffice technology. If you see a product that is based on LibreOffice technology, it means that it's using the LibreOffice transactional engine, which is common to all the application, and not only, is common to all platforms. So if you use LibreOffice on a mobile, actually the product is called Collabora Office because it's developed by Collabora, which is an ecosystem member. That engine is the same of the LibreOffice you are using on your desktop. And this means that the documents are the same, the user experience is the same, and the robustness of the code is the same.
That's interesting, but there is another question I have related to LibreOffice. So LibreOffice is free from a code, a software perspective. The code is free.
Sure.
Everybody can read the code. But LibreOffice is also free, as in I'm not charged any money to be able to download LibreOffice. For years, people have been telling me, if it's free, you are the product. Like we can see, for example, on Facebook. Am I the product with LibreOffice if it's free? How do you make money?
So actually, I think the free, you are the if it's free, you are the product is not related to LibreOffice, because LibreOffice, the code is free, but of course the users can deploy a binary, so there is no hidden agenda behind the source code of LibreOffice. We don't even ask for an email to download the software. Of course, if you make a donation, we ask for an email because we keep track of donation for security reasons, but this is a different story. So first, it's free because it's free software. So the source code is available. Everything is developed in a transparent way. Every person that is knowledgeable about software development can follow LibreOffice software development using our tools, which are Gerrit, Git, and all the others. You can look how the bugs are managed. You can see how the localization is done on WebLate. So our tools are all free tools. You have the links to the pages. You can see the pages, how they develop, and that is free software. So no hidden agenda behind it. How does free software pays for it? So first, as I said, donations. We have a donation page. People which are happy about using LibreOffice can donate. And in addition, there are let's call them business optimized version of LibreOffice that, of course, have a different support, have different support options. If you download LibreOffice from our website as an individual or as an organization, you have volunteer support. Volunteers are usually very competent, but they are not working full time to support LibreOffice. So in some cases, you get an answer in 5 minutes. In some cases, you may get an answer in 20 days just because the volunteers were not available at that time. And in some cases, you don't get an answer because the volunteer has not the answer and is not able to provide it. So there are companies which belong to the ecosystem, to the LibreOffice ecosystem, who have developed versions of LibreOffice which are backed by common support agreements. So and they have support license agreement. They are based on KPIs. They are available 24/7 and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, what happens is that the number of companies that rely on this version is unfortunately limited. It's probably not more than 5% of all the enterprises that use LibreOffice. And this has two drawbacks. The first one is that these companies, if they have a real problem, they miss professional support, because they cannot think that volunteers are supporting professionally a product. In some cases, people, I read the two of the support emails, and I can tell you that it's not infrequent that someone from a company has a very rude attitude to volunteers and say, come on, you should answer this question. And you say, sorry, we are volunteers. We are not supposed to provide you professional support. We can answer your question, but if you want professional support, you have to pay for it, because this is fair to the people that are studying, getting prepared to answer your questions, and doing professional activities to support your product. And in some cases, we get people understand and say, okay. In other cases, people, it starts becoming really rude, and this gives an idea on how uneducated are the users. We try to educate them. We don't want to move to open core, to an open core approach, where you get the basic features, and then if you want any additional feature, you have to pay for it, because that is not free software. So we want to stick to our copyleft license, and therefore we try to educate users by showing companies and speaking at conferences and meeting people, and just telling them you will save a huge amount. You can, if you move from Microsoft Office to LibreOffice, you cannot think to have the same level of service by just canceling what you were spending before. You have to understand that you have to invest a portion of what you were spending for licenses on support. Then it's up to you to decide if you want support from a company that has in-house developers, from a company that has not in-house developers and gets third-party developers. That's your option. We offer options with companies with in-house developers, with consultants that are able to source developers from the market and choose the best one for each activity. We have companies that offer long-term supported version out of the box, which means that you have a basic SLA agreement, which usually works for small to medium-sized company, works perfectly. It's perfectly adequate. Of course, if you have like some users, some LibreOffice users, you start to have more than 100,000 desktops. You cannot think that just buying an LTS version does your job, because out of 100,000 people using a software, you will for sure stumble in some hardware issue, in some compatibility issue, and you need someone that is able to look at your issue, technically look at the issue and solve it. So the second source, which we are trying to increase, is companies should be, let's say, companies paying for some version of LibreOffice which is professionally baked.
All right. So there is an ecosystem around LibreOffice, and
yes,
it's possible to have some professional support as a company. Before we get back to the adoption of LibreOffice, I'd like to just do a little hoop on the standard. So Microsoft Office uses a very specific file format. In the early days of Office, documents saved were dumps of the computer memory, which is quite scary, but made sense in the day, I guess, with the hardware limitation and power of the days. The newer revisions used, you touched it, the OpenXML format. As a naive user, I thought that OpenXML is called open because it's an open format. But you said it's not a real standard, and some bits of it are problematic. What makes it not standard, and what prevents it from being really the open standard?
So there are some conditions which are set by standard organization, not by me, but by standard organization to recognize a standard. First, is the reuse of standards. So for instance, let's make a clear example. If you have there is one standard image vector format, which is SVG. SVG is standard. LibreOffice is using SVG to import and export drawings. I make the SVG because it's easier to understand it than other standard, because everyone knows what an image is. So let's say that you have an image which is developed in a standard and saved in a standard format. And that is a recognized standard. Microsoft Office is using, deliberately, of course, a Microsoft vector format, which is not standard. So if you want to be compatible with the Microsoft Office, let's say with a PowerPoint file, you have to develop a Microsoft standard filter, or a filter for a Microsoft standard, instead of using a community developed filter for the recognized standard. So the first problem is that Microsoft Office is only reusing one standard, which is XML. And they cannot avoid using XML because otherwise the format could not be XML based. So basically they reuse the only standard they are forced to reuse. Second, the evolution of a standard must be done by an independent organization. ODF is managed by Oasis. Oasis is a consortium of companies. There are Microsoft, IBM, Oracle. There is Bank of America, the government of the United States, the Chinese government, the Taiwanese government, UNESCO, or UNO, NATO. You can name most of the organization that have to deal with documents. They are members of Oasis. So this means that Oasis is not supporting a specific company. Instead of it's working, of course, then it's using experts, but the experts have to go through an exam, the scanning of boards which are completely independent. The development of OpenOffice XML is done by ECMA. ECMA is European Computer Manufacturer Association. Is theoretically independent, but the problem is that all the members of ECMA have a commercial relationship with Microsoft. ECMA, there are HP, IBM, Asus, Acer, Fujitsu. They are all buying Windows licenses from Microsoft. The independence is not as open as it is in the case of Oasis, where no one is buying anything from Oasis. They may have relationship with the companies, but the relationship are completely extracted out of the Oasis domain. Third, the development has not only to be maintained by a third party, but has to be transparent. So if you look at the minutes of the meetings of the ODF Technical Committee, they are all published regularly on the Oasis website. They are public. The mailing list is public. So if there is a new commit for a specific feature, that commit can be analyzed by everyone. Of course, you have to be competent, technically competent. But let's say that your company that has developers could easily look at the development of ODF and understand what is the meaning of the different patches. Development of Office OpenXML is happens if it happens in, we don't know where it happens, because its minutes are not available. The mailing list at ECMA are private, and therefore there is no evidence of what is developed. What happens is that Microsoft is publishing every now and then an addendum to the standard, and they are so arrogant today that they don't even submit the updates to ISO. So basically, the standard, the last updates were submitted in 2012. So it's 10 years that you see developments, but the standard is another one. It's 10 years ago, is a 10 years ago standard. So but the fact is that they are so confident in the fact that everyone is using their format that they ignore completely the fact that it's a standard or should be a standard. Fourth or fifth. What is written in the standard description should be reflected in the document. So the standard has to be, you're looking at me like I'm telling something that is weird. Yes, because that is just old common sense. If you describe something, then what you describe should be exactly that. Unfortunately, this is exactly the opposite of what happens for Office OpenXML. You have a description and you have a different document. Then you have other details, like, for instance, the fact that they have developed a separate XML schema to describe the text, but then I'm really entering into technical details. I'm just to show you something which can you can understand the difference in a rather easy way. I'm just sharing a few slides, my screen. I will share a few slides. I'm not going to share the presentation, just sharing the slides that will show you what is the in a practical way, show you what is the what is the result of this situation. So you should see my LibreOffice as Shakespeare now.
Yes, so we can see it.
Okay, let's say that this is a simple sentence. To be or not to be, that is the question. I mean, it's 10 words, 11. So if you save as ODT in 2017, 2018, 2019, and I can go over every year, the way the LibreOffice is representing this sentence is always the same. And it's the same independently from the fact that the application is Writer or PowerPoint or Impress or Draw or whatever. If I look at the next slide, is how Microsoft Office as Shakespeare. This was in 2017. So to be, comma, preserve the space because you have just a space, or not to be, another comma which is in a separate line, space preserve. That is the question. You see, that's but you say, but if it's always this way, would be trivial to recover the format. The problem is that in 2018 you have a different way of representing it. In 2019 you have another different way of representing it. in 2020, 2022, you had a different way. So this is what I mean. You have a moving target. You have not a standard way. And just when the representation, this is, by the way, it's how Office 365 was writing it in 2020. So you see, it's a completely different way of handling the same text. And if we look at the color, if I show you this, for the brain is red, for the computer is FF0000. If you look at ODF, for writer, for calc, for impress, the string is always the same: format, color, and the color number. If you look at Office Open XML, you see that the XML is completely different for the three applications. So there's no consistency, there's no coherence. It's really an unfortunate situation. Of course, the problem is that users do not see all this mess behind the screen. But then when they exchange the document, the mess comes into reality. And then you hear users say, oh, but this was done with Office 2007, so today is not readable anymore. Which, if you have a standard, this is something that should never, never, never happen.
So there seems to be a lot of drawbacks to using the Microsoft Office format, which is actually not open for all the reasons you have cited. My next question then is, why isn't everyone using the OpenDocument format then?
The simple answer is because of the probably $100 million spent by Microsoft on lobbying every year. The more complicated one is that if it's Microsoft, it has to be better, which is just, nonsense. But we have, if you look at Microsoft Office, the format of the page is under File, Print, the print setup or something like that. In LibreOffice is Format Page. I had people that said it doesn't make any sense to have a format page under Format Page. It should be where the printer is. I said, come on, let's accept that is where the printer is, but you cannot tell me that Format Page shouldn't be where under Format. Is Format Page and is under Format Page. It's logical, but Microsoft is doing in another way. Okay, they're doing it wrong. Sorry. I'm not telling you that we are more intelligent. It's probably we are more respectful of the users.
Right. So there is a strong culture. Some people might have been used to Microsoft Office for a long time, to the point that they are not used to different interfaces. So this is a cultural issue in a way.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, most people of OpenTech will save us is a technical audience. I am a technical person, so I do care about open standards. I'm not really sure if people, end users in general, do care about open standards. It's either it works or not. Are open standards only solving the technical issues, like having the documents being represented in the same way over the years, or is it more to that?
So of course, this is also, I think we should look at the broader picture. Of course, if you look at the importance of open standard for a single document, then I think we could represent that document with any format. It doesn't care. It's a single document. If I want to show it to you, I print it, and worst case, I print it, I scan it, I send you the image. If we look at the issue under the perspective of global knowledge over a long time, a long period, then using open standards is not just important, should be a must. Imagine today, I mean, I've spent many of my young days in libraries, because at the time there was no way of reading a book apart from going to the library, lending the book, best case, or staying in the library for days to read the book. And this is what I did for my thesis, for instance. I had to access books which was not possible to, not just to lend, not even to photocopy. So they were giving you the book. You had to wear white gloves to look at the book, because they were historical ones. Today, that book has been digitalized. And it has been digitalized in a standard format. That book will be available for the eternity. And this, of course, is for the historical books. But if you write a book today, and if you write using a standard, your content, the user content, will be available also for the eternity. This means, and of course, I'm not talking about infringing intellectual property. But if the contents are available and they're properly managed in terms of intellectual property, if we use standard, we would, in probably 20, 50 years, we will probably be able to access all the human knowledge by using software. And I don't think that anyone thinks that in 50 years you will go back to typewriting your thesis, as I did in 78. So the advantage of having an encyclopedia like Wikipedia today is because you have the HTML standard and the wiki format that allows to make contents available. But just imagine if not just an encyclopedia, but all the books can become available because they are produced, written using, and saved and shared using a standard. Just imagine what this means in terms of research, what it means in terms of scientific research. Scientific papers would have data which are easy to access. The issue is that we had to change the genome names because Excel was not handling them properly, which is a criminal offense to the human mind.
Oh, is it the story of Excel passing things as date
exactly.
or something like that?
Like months, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of going to Microsoft and say, guys, you did it wrong, you have to correct it, the scientific community at the end had to change the name of genomes, which are proper. My genome is mine. Your genome is yours. It's not Microsoft. And we are at the point of having Microsoft ruling genome names. So it's completely, it's we can say that in this case, the world is upside down.
I have a question to follow up a bit on that. And well, it's the last question I'm going to use to torture you, because I'm not asking nice questions to you.
No, man, don't worry.
So at the moment, there is the Digital Markets Act being discussed in Europe, which is all about competition and about interoperability, which seems to be quite relevant in the topic of LibreOffice and OpenDocument. So it's a double question, actually, I'm going to ask you. First, is the Document Foundation involved in lobbying in the European level to get the Digital Markets Act to be meaningful? And two, don't you think that having everybody adhere to a standard is going to prevent innovation because it's going to take more time to get everyone to agree on a new standard?
So we are trying to lobby using the tools that we have, which is the power of educating and convincing people. We don't have money, so, and we don't have, we cannot, and even if we all gather together, we will never have the same amount of money. So we have to find, and I had a conference call today to discuss this topic. We probably have to gather together around the topic of making open standards real for the user. The problem is that politicians, even if they understand, their agenda is not based, their agenda is based on votes and convenience, not on protecting the user. So let's say that we try to do what we can, but it's not easy. There are even open source or open core projects that have married for convenience Microsoft format. And so they are trying to bash ODF instead of supporting it. So I think that the battle at the end I think that the move to the digitalization at the end will convince people that choosing open standards is the right thing to do, but it will take more time than if politicians did their real job, which was to choose what is better for citizens. Politicians are paid by citizens' taxes, but are not giving back to citizens. They are giving back to corporations. This is the unfortunate reality, at least in Europe, in the States for sure, but in many, many, many economies. And standards, the reality that is that about your question about innovation. So standards are moving slowly because they are standards. So you cannot change a standard without reaching consensus and agreement. So on one side, standards are moving slowly. Yes, I agree. On the other side, standards foster innovation just because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Your company, the software that you developed exists because there is the matrix standard that allows to have transparent exchange of contents at chat level, at video level in a sense, but people can interact because they can completely ignore what there is behind the scenes just because you are caring about the standard, Jitsi is caring about the standard, and so on and so forth. If you want to build another service, you just build on the existing standards. Of course, what standards are doing, they foster open innovation. They don't foster closed innovation. But the open innovation is what pushes forward the humanity. If we look at, for instance, at healthcare, it's true that there are patents around and which should be handled in a different way. But if the healthcare research was just done by companies and not by university, by researchers around the world, for instance, we wouldn't have got vaccines in a short term because people were working for a common objective. Then, of course, you have different vaccines, different approaches, but this is research. You have different solutions for the same issue. But I think that if you look at human knowledge, the progress of human knowledge happens by exchange of information, not by keeping information for yourself. So I think that we should start to think about open development based on standards. It's a change of mentality. It's a complete change of mentality. When I started working in the early 80s, the environment was completely different. It has changed quite a lot. Companies are still, and of course, the task for the job of companies in some cases was easier. You could you were developing your own product, ignoring completely what was around you. And these had a huge cost for the user. A printer I started in technology in the printer area. So a printer in the 80s, in the early 80s, the price of a printer was probably 10 times as more than the cost of a printer today. But the printer today has probably 1,000 more features than the printer in the 80s. But in the 80s, if you had a printer, you needed a driver for each software and a different driver for each software. The printer was not plug and play. Of course, that was the best for that time. But after 40 years, I think we have developed an open approach to some to technology, which we should leverage instead of dreaming about going back to the 80s where each one could control his walled garden. Just an example. In the 80s, I was marketing manager for a printer company. I was handling global marketing. And when people ask me, did you change over the years? And I said, let's imagine that the Italo Vignoli of today meets the Italo Vignoli of 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it was 27. So the 27 years old guy would not have any doubt in taking a gun and shooting the old Italo Vignoli, because I've completely changed my attitude to standards. But because I have, thanks for my brain, I have evolved. Even if I was rather old at the time to enter into technology, and I'm definitely old today for technology, but I try to follow the evolution. Companies should do the same. Today, open standards should be the rule. Of course, they make your life a little bit more difficult, but they make the life of users a lot easier and a a lot more funny, because once you discover the advantage of standards, technology opens a new world around your eyes. And that's the end of my talk.
Thanks a lot, Italo.
Also because it's 7, so I should leave the other hour to other people otherwise.
It's quite frustrating because there are many topics that we have not covered, that we could cover, and we could spend hours, I think, discussing it, because there is a lot behind open standards. We have touched briefly the culture of people being accustomed to Microsoft Office and not being necessarily open to the change, even if in the long run it would benefit them. We have been touching the topic of policy making briefly, but there would be a lot more to tell about that.
Yeah.
So maybe we will need to have another episode or
No
to talk
problem.
in greater length.
I'm not planning to disappear for the next 10 years,
Oh
at
yes,
least.
please don't.
At
Please
least.
don't. Thank you very much, Italo. It was a super interesting discussion with you. We need to move on, and we are going to move on with the people of Openstreetmap, who are building on top of open standards, but they have more than that. Jean-Marc, are you around?
Hello.
Hello, Jean-Marc. Bonsoir. Can you introduce yourself
Bonsoir.
briefly
I'm Jean.
and the
I'm,
Openstreetmap project as well, please?
yeah. So I'm Jean-Marc Liotier. I'm a member of the board of the Openstreetmap Foundation. And for those who don't know OpenStreetMap, you may already know Wikipedia. Wikipedia, where anyone can contribute, anyone can correct, and it's a common object built cooperatively. And OpenStreetMap is exactly that, but for maps. So if the name of your street is wrong on the map, you can correct it. You just click on edit. If your favorite restaurant is absent, you add it. If you wish to inform everyone that your local restaurant is accessible for wheelchairs, you might also add that detail, and so on. It's not only a map, it's data. And that's what makes it different from many applications you might have used, many websites where the map is a bit of a drawing. You see a nice drawing that represents a landscape, a city, or anything, but ultimately, that's just a drawing. And at some point, you might want to do something more computer-like with the map, like compute the optimal uh, way between 2 points, or between multiple points, or between populations and hospitals. And then you need road data, you need hospital data, you need something which you will not get anywhere else outside of proprietary data sets. So that's what OpenStreetMap provides. And OpenStreetMap, in the context of standards, well, it's a bit contrarian, because in the field of standards, and especially in the internet, standards are about interoperating, about different actors being able to work together. And usually that means decentralization, independent actors talking the same language. And for OpenStreetMap, it's different. OpenStreetMap is completely centralized. There is only one OpenStreetMap. It's a single database, and the standards exist, of course, but at a different level. So the reason for centralization first, that's pretty important. And as anyone who might have worked with decentralized architectures knows, especially for example, chat applications, context of matrix, discoverability is a huge challenge. It's just the biggest challenge for all that sort of applications. And you could very well imagine some sort of decentralized map system where you can have sources in many different servers and competing repositories for a type of data, but that's very, very hard to manage. And if you centralize things, works, it's much easier. It has drawbacks, but it does have huge advantages. If you look at competition between Mastodon and Twitter, conceptually, they both serve the same sort of microblogging usage, but on one, you will easily find all the users, whereas on the others, it's more difficult. You need a central index. You need to go the index to take into account different servers. So OpenStreetMap solves that problem by being centralized. And that brings forward the importance of politics and the importance of the OpenStreetMap Foundation. That is, the whole thing holds on the board of the OpenStreetMap Foundation, 7 members, of which I'm one, and we defend the license. We protect the project through defending the license. License is some sort of share-alike license, which lets everyone use the data, provided that they give attribution to the OpenStreetMap Foundation and that they keep the data open for other users. So that's something also which is contrarian to a mindset that has been prevalent on the early internet, in which the idea was that technology will save people. If the technology is right, then everything else will follow. Code is low, all that sort of stuff. And actually, at some point, there is a legal world, and it can be a burden, but it can also be something to lean on. It can be a platform which let us build more open systems, and OpenStreetMap is part of that. The license is central, and that's what lets OpenStreetMap get away with being centralized, which will be a problem, but it's not, because we make sure that we keep it open. So it does have a standard API. It's quite stable because we moved from 0.5 to 0.6 in 2009, and it remains stable ever since. So that's pretty stable by internet standards. Well, the trick is that the API does not do much. The API is about contributing. So to contribute to OpenStreetMaps, you need editing software. There are many of them. You can have them in a web browser. That's what most users use. But we also have a Java editor, which is where most of the edits happen. So it's more of a power user thing. But there are many alternative editors, mobile editors, editors which are not classic in the sense of being a map on which you put things, because you can edit in bulk, you can edit just the names, you can respond to questions from your phone that ask you, is that road paved or not? And you answer yes, and that's actually data you input into OpenStreetMap.
Is that street complete?
Yeah, that sort of things.
Yeah,
Exactly.
okay.
So there are many ways, many editors, but they all share the same API, which is the right API. On the read side, if you want to access OpenStreetMap data, basically you export it from the database. So there are many outlets for that, and then you do things with it. So the basic thing you can do is you apply a style sheet to it, and from the style sheet and the data, you produce a map. The style sheet will, for example, say, well, if you find for example, highway residential, then you will color it gray and will be that thick and so on. If you find natural equal wetland, then you will draw something looking like some swamp. Anything's possible, power lines, rail, and that's part of the power of that API and that centralized database, is that like all collaborative endeavors, it has network effects. With many other map products, are very car-centric, for example. That's something which is extremely common. OpenStreetMap draws together very different populations. So you find people who are fans of the railways, so they will make railways and add details such as how wide are the tracks and what's the voltage and what's the material used for the track sleepers, anything. That's niche interest. Same wise, you can have people interested in power lines. So they will add all the details for the power line, what sort of construction for the towers, how many cables, tension, and so on. But if you're a hiker, actually that's quite interesting because you look at the landscape for navigation, and in the distance you see a power line, and then you see the power line on your map, and you know where you are without having to resort to GPS or something like that, because the map is more navigable with landmarks. So you see a very niche interest, which is mapping power lines, and it feeds into another interest, which is hiking in nature. So there are synergies between different population within OpenStreetMap. Um, so in that way, the niche interest can be wider. There is a lot of cyclists that contribute to OpenStreetMap, big cyclist population, because of course they are not happy with competitors who are mostly maps for cars. They want details about cycleways, about bicycle parking and all that, and that put it OpenStreetMap. And it's actually a hobby for many of them, because if you go cycling, then you take pictures, you remember details, and when you go home, you find out that something's missing on the map and you add it. So it's kind of combining the cycling and the mapping. It's a fun way to go out. But so you will find websites, applications that cater to cyclists, and they use OpenStreetMap data. GeoVelo, come out, cycle.travel, and that the SIG into OpenStreetMap as a platform for building applications of all sorts. It's a platform in the sense that the value addition occurs outside of a project. OpenStreetMap caters to developers. OpenStreetMap caters to service providers. Most end users are not aware they are using OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is contributor-oriented. OpenStreetMap as a project is contributor-oriented and is developer-oriented. So people will experience OpenStreetMap, for example, looking at map at the train station. The French, well, Paris region trains have maps which are OpenStreetMap in the station with detailed mapping, and they have been financing surveys to make that complete. If you look at some big blue social websites, their maps are from OpenStreetMap. And if you, well, then many providers of mapping services will use OpenStreetMap data. So most users, they just use maps, they just use data, and they are not aware that OpenStreetMap is what powers this. So of course, we try to raise awareness. Part of the license, part of the attribution requirements are that the map must show attribution, because we think that if the end user sees the OpenStreetMap logo on the map, he will maybe consider the implications and that maybe he could correct the data and add his home. That's the first thing that any new contributor does, is adding his home into the map. And well, the business model around all that is people want things on the map, they put it on OpenStreetMap, and they consume the data. And that's something about the OpenStreetMap Foundation, is that by foundation standard, it's tiny. Budget is very small. We're like 1% of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an organization with a lot of staff, a lot of budget, That's not the case with OpenStreetMap, because the philosophy is that we need to remain independent. That's the core. It's essential. And one way to remain independent is to remain frugal, to ensure that if some big company who give us money is not happy with us because we are too strict about license enforcement, for example, well, if they don't want to give money anymore, we need to be able to survive. So we need to keep the burn rate low. That's extremely important. And that's part of what we've been doing. Lately, we've had to hire some couple people because, of course, the systems administration, for example, we need to professionalize it a bit. Many people are getting to rely on the core infrastructure. So far, it's always been volunteers, which have been excellent and have kept the lights on, and they do an incredible amount of work. The foundation is structured with working groups for different specialties, and that's where the magic happens. The working groups do the heavy lifting. Actually, action is not at the board level. Action is in the working group. The board is just the pinnacle, the guardians of the license, but not the actual worker. That's the working groups. So we had to do some hiring, but still, we try to keep it light. And it's a bureaucracy. When people want to do things with OpenStreetMap, they grab the data and they do it. They don't have to ask the permission from anyone. And that's the platform aspect of OpenStreetMap is no gatekeepers. You want to get the data, you get it. Again, where usually open standards mean standards for interoperability and talking the same language, OpenStreetMap is Babel. It's just incredibly messy. The data model is not standardized at all. Well, almost. Okay, there are some basic standards of doing things, but it's a key value model in which you can use any key and any value you want. And that disappoints people from traditional GIS background and enterprise background. If you do enterprise GIS, you first start making a schema. And you say, yeah, that's how the data will be. These are the allowed types, and this is the different layers. And once you define that, you implement it, and the user will input data. That's not how it works in OpenStreetMap. People input data any way they want. They tag it as they see it. And inevitably, they clash because people see things differently, and it gives birth to huge mailing list discussions. And sometimes it's a bit rough, but we try to keep it civil always, of course. And consensus emerges. People will document the way to tag things in the wiki. Because why is it highway residential? We could say a highway equal local or highway equal street, but it turns out that the consensus became highway residential. And well, after a while, the whole tagging converges on it. Sometimes a different standard emerges on different continents, and then someone who makes maps from it say, well, look, I'm writing software to take advantage of OpenStreetMap, and I'm seeing that there are two different ways of doing the same thing. So how are you going to do it? So it's all very social. So as we see, interoperability well, is guaranteed by the humans in it and the fact that they communicate. And ultimately, there will be technical standards in tagging schemes that will be documented and that will be respected, implemented in editors, because editors have much responsibility in furthering correct tagging scheme because they help people who map data. So if the correct tagging is available through some big icon on the editor, yeah, people will use it. But what tagging scheme ends up there needs to be a lot of work upstream to reach that. And yeah, so foundations that are legal and social rather than technical, that's what makes OpenStreetMap a bit different. But ultimately, it's about interoperability, which is getting people to work together, and that's what makes OpenStreetMap.
Excellent. There are many topics you have touched. A lot of them are of interest to me, especially this evening. You have been talking about governance, about policy, about politics. You have been talking about getting the data, about the importance of centralization for your specific projects. So we have many things to talk about. I have been asking nasty questions to Italo, so I need to ask you silly questions as well. So OpenStreetMap has a lot of data. Many people with different interests can contribute and use it, but you have very rich maps. But Google Maps works well. So what's the point of creating OpenStreetMap in the first place?
Well, first thing is Google Maps has a bit of a different purpose, and that's something which is, of course, misunderstood by newcomers to OpenStreetMap, especially developers. Say, why don't you give us the same APIs as Google's? Well, OpenStreetMap is not an API platform for mapping services. It's data. OpenStreetMap is a bunch of data. Here, take the data. And then other providers use the data to build platforms analog to Google Maps. But that's a different business in which OpenStreetMap is not. So why use OpenStreetMap? First, the type of data in it is different. You have to understand that Google Maps is an advertising platform. That's the business of Google. It's advertising. So Google Maps is interested in things that where they can sell advertising. The map is actually a huge billboard for brands. And if you look at the mapping style in Google, they put forward brands, uh, restaurants with reviews, and shops with the shop logo from paid by the shop owners and stuff like that. So it's whole advertising. And if you're not looking for something to buy, you're not looking for an hotel, you're not looking for a shop, you're not looking for a restaurant, well, that's not the map for you. You need something else. Because if you need a map of a fire hydrant, well, OpenStreetMap has one. If you need a map of defibrillators, someone made one. That's actual example. It's a bit silly, but people made that. If you want to do skateboarding routing, well, you need to know the smoothness of the road because that's important for skateboarding. And well, Google won't tell you that. You have to add a smoothness attribute to the road segment, and you can do that in OpenStreetMap. And actually, in many places, you will find that smoothness attribute. So you can weight your routing algorithm using smoothness. And it will be a different routing algorithm to the one you use for cycling, where you don't care that much about smoothness. So the idea is that, um, well, scratch your own itch, traditional open source way, and scratch your own itch in OpenStreetMap means uh, just add the data you need. That's how I started OpenStreetMap. I started with OpenStreetMap. I mean, I've been a user for 12 years. I was cycling in Africa with extremely bad maps. I got lost and it was miserable. And I was keeping GPS tracks of where I was going. So when I got back, I had been already for years into Debian and stuff like that. And I thought, well, maybe there got to be another way, and people might have done something like that. And I stumbled upon OpenStreetMap and started dumping my GPS traces in it. At the time, we did not have good orbital imagery, which we have now. And I started adding detail that I would like to have had when I was there. And actually, when I map with OpenStreetMap, I do that like, some people, they do embroidery or knitting for relaxation. Well, I do mapping. And I try to build the map that I want to have when I go cycling. That's my motivation, my personal motivation as a user. So the reason for using OpenStreetMap is you make the map that you want to use. And maps are tools which mean different things to different people. And it's, of course, not what a mass market publisher will do, because they will try to solve everyone's problem. And they're actually very good at it for some segments of usage, which are the most common. But of course, the long tail of usage is not covered by those mass market offerings. And the long tail is where things like OpenStreetMap shine, because all the niche usage, all the niche interest, everything that's not covered by the mass market is welcome, and that's what makes OpenStreetMap unique.
All right, so if I got things correctly, OpenStreetMap is not a product in itself. It's more like a gigantic database that many people can contribute to. And
Yes.
as an end user, I will never really use OpenStreetMap. I will use a product that takes advantage of all the data available in OpenStreetMap. So you said everybody can access the data. Me as a user, I will probably, well, I can use an editor and access the data, etc. But if I were a developer, and I'm a terrible one, so that would be a terrible idea, but if I were a developer and I wanted to create a product that takes advantage of OpenStreetMap, could I just connect it to the OpenStreetMap server and just let it do its life, or should I take some precautions?
Well, the developing applications built on OpenStreetMap do not directly connect to the core OpenStreetMap database. There is always a stage of export. Take a snapshot, a copy, an export, whatever. You take the data, put it somewhere, usually a PostGIS database. So Postgres with extensions for geographical data, which is now standard. You find it in all the Linux distributions and more. And usually at the import stage, you will select what sort of data you want in your database. Because if you input the whole of OpenStreetMap, that's many gigabytes, dozens of gigabytes, maybe we have more than 100. I don't really know the actual size, but anyway, you will be overwhelmed. So you have to choose what you want. Do you want the whole road hierarchy? Do you want the land users? Do you want the POI for tourism? Select it, put it in the database, and then on top of that, build the application. And for that, of course, there are many libraries nowadays to facilitate your work. So if you just want to display a map, you can use whatever JavaScript library, leaflet, open layers, and embed that into your web application. And that's not a lot of code for basic functionality, but you can put it as far as you want. If you want to make a lot of extra functionality, you can extend it any way you want. But the basics are actually quite easy for display. And then all the advanced use. If you need to join the data with something else, which is very common, if you need to manage it, because sometimes you will want to follow objects throughout the life cycle. Say you are some local authorities, such as a town hall, and you want to keep track of your street lamps. So each street lamp have a serial number to identify it. But some of the data is public. The position of a street lamp, that's public data. You want it in OpenStreetMap. And it has applications. For example, there are routing engines that will let you calculate routes, walking routes by foot in towns that go through streets that are lit, which is important for safety. If you're a person and you don't feel safe in a city and you want to walk in a lit street, it's better for you. OpenStreetMap offers that sort of functionality. Routing engine using OpenStreetMap do it. So let's say your town hall and you have your street lamps. So you're going to publish the position of the street lamps and, well, put it in OpenStreetMap directly. But then you need to manage them. So you will have to join that data with your internal data, because your internal data says that you spent $2,000 for that street lamp and that you bought it on that date and that the supplier. It's proprietary data. You don't want to share that. So you need to link both. And that sort of thing is something you can, of course, develop, and people have been doing that sort of thing. You can very well manage the boundaries between your private and public data, but that's the sort of thing you have to build on top. Then, of course, well, and anything you can think of that you need to locate outdoors, that's classic OpenStreetMap. Indoors, that's pretty much the bleeding edge, because indoor mapping is some sort of micro mapping, and locating devices indoor is difficult since you don't get GPS. So, but people are experimenting with that, and you're seeing it increasingly. Um, whatever has a position in space can be put on OpenStreetMap. So the applications are endless, but building them is always the same. Extract the data, put it in some sort of database server, and put an application layer on top of that to take advantage of the data.
Okay, so we have two distinct things. We have the data itself, which is, I would say, intellectually available to every individual and organization, actually. And there is the infrastructure serving it. There is something else. The data itself, it doesn't come out of thin air. You have been talking about several ways that the data is added. It can be individuals who have their own itch to scratch, or it could be organizations who have something to build and they want the data to be available. Do you know if most of the data comes from individuals or from organizations?
Most of it comes from individuals, but increasingly organizations play a role. And that was a subject of friction a few years ago, because people were realizing, oh, mega corporation is coming and they are taking over and editing the data and they are paying people to do it, and what's going on. And some of them try to do it clandestinely, hiding their identity, and it was a subject of clashes. Nowadays, it's normalized. Corporations who want to participate are welcome. They have, of course, to disclose that they are performing organized mapping. We have a process for that. They can declare themselves, they can document their process, identify their contributors, and it's like any open source project where there are individual contributors and corporate contributors, and they have all to play by the same rule and do it transparently. So nowadays that works. But one thing which is extremely important in OpenStreetMap, it's a map made by humans, and that's essential. There are ways to automate cartography. You take satellite imagery, you take some sort of learning model, and you apply it, and you extract features from the orbital imagery. So for example, you can make a big data set of buildings. You teach a model, you tell the model that is a building. If you see that shape on the map, it's a building. You run the model on the imagery, and you extract all the buildings in the world, and you don't dump them in OpenStreetMap, because that will be ugly. So what happened is that, of course, that technology exists and it's useful, but it's useful if humans make the last judgment. So there are a couple, for example, of data sets of buildings which have been made available through a license which lets OpenStreetMap use them. But the process is always that a human looks at it, say, okay, this building, yeah, I confirm that it exists, I know where it is, and I add it to OpenStreetMap. So automated features accelerate the mapping quite a bit, but ultimately it has to be human, because human interpretation is what makes a map. A map is not a recording of all that exists. It's a recording of what a human thinks that is worth recording. So there is a filter in it, and it's social, it's completely subjective, and that's what makes the character of the map. And it applies equally to individual contributors and to corporate contributors.
And we are touching a nice topic that actually we had the question in the chat. Here we are assuming that both the organizations and the individuals are making the changes in good faith. But is there a process to prevent abuse, or is there a record of some abuse that has happened? People who might have been trying to deface the map or to make nasty things.
It has completely happened, and it is completely a problem. So there are two things. First, the whole history of edition is recorded from scratch. We have complete history of all objects, and we can trace everything. So that's extremely important, especially if there are license disputes about copyrighted things that end up in OpenStreetMap. There have been, of course, reversals of that. So some edits have been reverted because they were from copyrighted sources. That happens. There have been reverts because of vandalism. So there is a data team who is the ultimate arbitration authority for that. You can complain and you can escalate the issues if discussions of the mailing list have not been sufficient to treat it. And ultimately, it's the open source ways. Many eyes make all bugs shallow, but that requires eyes, and that's a scarce resource. So automation to the rescue. If you look at what Facebook did, they created a distribution of OpenStreetMap data, which is called the daylight distribution. And they said, okay, we're going to take the OpenStreetMap data, but we can't allow a big penis to appear on the map on our homepage. So we're going to detect all that automatically and vouch for it. So they take the data and they apply a whole bunch of heuristics to it. They try to see what data comes from old contributors, from new contributors, data that might be sensitive, such as the name of the big cities. There have been vandalism on the name of New York at some point. So if a capital city's name is edited, that's very suspicious. So a library of rules, like something you will do on your mail server for anti-spam rules, just much more sophisticated than that because it has to take into account geometry, the history of contributors, the history of features, and all sorts of things. And from that, they create a data set which is OpenStreetMap but sanitized. And that's what they put out. And they put that data set available openly, freely. Anyone can use it, by the way. So that's the sort of work which is necessary. There is quality insurance. And just as any free software distribution, so the software is provided as is. That's what's written on the license. So you can use it, but hey, who knows what happened? Maybe your house will burn. So OpenStreetMap, like any free software project, does not guarantee anything. But the idea is that editors patrol the map, and there are many tools for that. For example, I use OSM-Che, which lets you define a zone, and you say, well, warn me whenever edits happen in this zone, and you can make criteria. I want to see all the edits that involve a garage, and in that zone, if it involves whatever user, and I can have a RSS stream from that or make alerts or whatever. I'm interested in my village and I will watch all the edits in my village. So ultimately, it is social. And the best data comes from the places with the most contributors. That's logical. So you can add quality insurance steps on top of that, automate it, but the result pretty much works. And usually the vandalism is reverted very quickly, but it is a problem. That's true. So if you're familiar with what happens in Wikipedia, where vandalism is also a problem, it's extremely similar as a moderation process.
Right. And beyond that, you mentioned Facebook pulling the data, doing some quality insurance, and then making the data available to the general public. As a company, if I develop a very specific product, I can pull the data from OpenStreetMap. I can maybe enrich it locally on my side. And what incentives do I have to publish back the data to contribute to OpenStreetMap?
Well, what you have is not an incentive, it's a legal obligation from the license. So the idea is that, yeah, if you mix OpenStreetMap data with something else and you publish it, well, you're actually publishing enriched OpenStreetMap data that's subject to the OpenStreetMap license. So, of course, like the LGPL debate, for example, where you can link a library, but it's a different license from your software. And if you separate the layers clearly, like you have an OpenStreetMap background layer, and on top of that, you have your proprietary layer. Well, those are two distinct layers, and you can do that because you're not actually mixing the data, you are presenting them side by side. So that's a case in which different data sources clearly identified as such can be used. So OpenStreetMap is not going to make your precious proprietary data suddenly legally open. It's not. But if you actually mix it, improve it in any way, then you are subject to OpenStreetMap license, and that requires share alike, basically.
Okay, very interesting. So, do you have any final thoughts you would like to add? Any topics we have not touched? I'm trying to stay a bit wary of time. Is there anything you'd like to add to maybe want to funnel people to contribute to OpenStreetMap?
Well, it's fun. It's fun, and it's people take up knitting in the evening to get their mind off whatever they've been doing during the day, and OpenStreetMap is like that. You can spend 10 minutes on it, you can spend 10 hours on it. Everyone's welcome. The barrier to entry is extremely low. You create an account and you go, you edit. There is a welcoming community. You can ask questions, people will be happy to answer them, and really you can start small. You can really start with, is my street correctly mapped? Oh, that's not the right name. I click on edit, I change the name, I save, and that's my first OpenStreetMap edit. So really anyone can do it, and give it a try. And maybe you will still be awake at 4 because you've been finding other things to edit.
All right, thanks a lot, Jean-Marc. I can recommend people who are completely new to OpenStreetMap, if they have an Android device, to use the Street Complete application. It's pretty good actually, because it's a sort of quest. You just go outside and move around, and your phone is going to ask you questions like, is this sidewalk here? Can somebody who is blind have a way to see the sidewalk, etc. You have many questions to make sure that the quality of the map is good. We have touched various topics which were very interesting, ranging from governance to data quality to abuse management to sharing the data, having incentives to keep sharing the data, not going in prison being one strong incentive when you use the data. So thank you very much, Jean-Marc. That was a very interesting conversations, and keep working on OpenStreetMap. It's a fascinating project, and I want to see it. In 10 years, I'm going to ask you if the last published API is still 2009. Thank you very much, Jean-Marc. We're going to move on to Hookshot. So some members of the audience might not know Matrix for the few of them, I think. It's a protocol for secure and decentralized communication. The most popular usage of it in practice is for secure and decentralized instant messaging. To make it simple, it's a bit like email, but secure and instantaneous. And Matrix has a concept of bridges. A bridge is a piece of software to translate what happens in a system into matrix messages, roughly. To follow the email analogy, a bridge would be like translating text messages, SMS, into emails in my email client, if Matrix was email. So we are moving on with Hookshot, who is the bridges man at Element, author of many bridges to translate what happens on several systems to Matrix, IRC, Slack, Teams. But today we're not going to talk about them. We're going to talk about a more specific bridge, which is actually not that specific. I'm going to leave the floor to you to introduce what Hookshot is and how we can make good use of it with open standards.
I'm going to share a presentation because I spent 5 minutes doing one. Let's talk about Hookshot and also about myself, which are sort of where we've gone through that already. Bridge person, bridge adjacent, currently working on next generation of bridges. We'll go into that a bit of detail. So I've worked through a lot of open standards over the years because as bridges, what you do is essentially interoperate other standards with Matrix, trying to pull data in, push data out, and trying to have it all in a sort of sensible, understandable way. And so that is what a bridge does. But to talk about Hookshot for a minute, it's essentially a multi-service webhook bridge for Matrix. I don't like calling it a webhook bridge because it sort of trivializes what it does. But if you want to think about it, basically it takes data in from a variety of sources and spits out Matrix events. And in the other way, if someone on Matrix talks, it spits it back out in the right format for that particular service. So like most of our bridges, but in a different way that it's a singular project trying to handle many different things. So to go into that in a bit more detail, it supports GitHub, supports GitLab, Figma, which is our design product for designing things, RSS and Atom feeds, Jira tickets, which is a new thing recently added, quite popular, and then of course generic webhooks, which are sort of just any data that you push in through HTTP gets pushed into Matrix as an event. How it looks under the hood, it's a bit like this, a nice complicated diagram to keep everyone awake. We've got a home server on the far left here, which is sort of where your data is being sent to, which has been handled by a Hookshot processor. And as you can see here, stuff's basically coming in from GitHub or GitLab or whatever service you like, gets pushed through to a worker. We have this little reader in here that sort of handles the temporary storage as a message queue, but then gets pushed through and ends up everywhere. There's also a client and a widget, which I'm going to show off in a minute, which is really exciting, but basically improves our UX, the whole thing. So the project itself is written in TypeScript, recently being converted to Rust over time because we're deciding the performance of Rust, and also it's quite enjoyable to write stuff in Rust. The other thing that's quite cool is it doesn't have a storage mechanism of itself. It uses Matrix for all of its storage, with a tiny bit of it ending up in Redis. So the room state in Matrix, I guess room state is what you describe as persistent events in a Matrix room. So permanent data as opposed to a timeline event, which is sort of a message. You scroll up and down, messages come and go, but state is sort of persistent. And Hookshot essentially brutally uses this to store all of its configuration for each individual room. The secret data being stored inside account data, which is a key value protocol, a key value database inside Matrix for storing private data. The upshot of this is that basically you can move Hookshot anywhere you like around your network or have it stored anywhere. As long as it can talk to your home server, it still works. You haven't got to worry about this secondary database file or another Postgres hanging around somewhere. You can just move it about. And the final thing is it's architected to be scalable. A bit of a shake-up from our previous projects. This one can be run as a monolith or can split up into different processes. The idea being if you're running as a massive organization, you have thousands of events a second, it can handle it. Also, if you're just running it for personal usage as I do, you can have it run as a monolith, which is just a nice feature to have. So I wanted to talk a little bit about generic webhooks because I think it's the most appropriate for this conversation. The way this basically works is you get a little URL like this one, and whatever service you're talking to, of the thousands of webhook supported services out there, you just plug this URL into the settings in your application, and suddenly it speaks Matrix. Because Hookshot's goal is basically to take any data in that you're sent from anywhere and then just push it into a room. I can give a demo of this because I have it running, hopefully. So this is my room, my webhooks playground. As you can see here, this widget kindly go away for a minute. Cool. Okay, so this is my room, and what I've got down here, which you probably can't see, if I can try and make it bigger, is just a terminal window. You can see here we've got our URL and our room. If I send a message into the room like this, you can see here it sends a message straight through, and all that was HTTP curl hits with some text in it. The other nice thing you can do is, if I find the right, this one here, you can actually send in through some data as JSON straight into the room as well, which is also handy if your API supports JSON. If you look into the event source for the message, you can see here that the Hookshot has basically taken the data you sent through HTTP and stuck it inside a matrix event. Therefore, if you have some sort of consuming application, that data is preserved in its original format, which is super nice to have. I've also sneakily accidentally given away the feature we've also written is that Hookshot supports mutations through JavaScript functions, which are directly written inside the matrix room itself, which is a super cool ability, which basically means as a user of this bridge, you can write your own code to interpret data being sent to the bridge and then spit it out as particular formats. So if I give an example of how this looks, and we go through to the state event, and we look for this one, you can see here the actual function itself, which is all sandbox perfectly fine, but it's basically written inside the state event itself. So the actual processing code for each individual message is sort of handled on the fly, which is really useful for teams who are, trying to build out a webhook event and don't necessarily be pushing plugins to some backend server or trying to deal with managing deployments and things. This all just happens, as you do it. And what's also quite cool in this particular release of Hookshot is you can edit it inside the browser. So this is our new integrations panel, the widget we were talking about earlier, which basically lets you configure Hookshot on the fly completely inside your client. If we go through to generate webhooks, you can see here you can create a webhook. But what's quite exciting is you can actually go down here and start editing the code for your webhook. So if you wanted to suddenly change things around, I don't know, let's say we wanted to add, let's multiply the values, so that's fun. So if we get this here, we can just do something like data count is times 5. And then all we have to do here is we save this. And then we go and send the data through again. You can see here the multiplication's gone through, the code's changed, and suddenly you can start writing these dynamic bits of code to interpret stuff on the fly. You haven't even got to write some code to handle the matrix side of things. It's all just done what was literally 16 lines of code. Suddenly lowers the bar quite significantly for people wanting to, build their integrations into matrix. And it's all just, runs completely open source and we can use it. I'll go back to what I was talking about next, which was, I was doing a demo next, right? But there is more demos to be done. So we have also things in other than webhooks. We have GitHub integrations and GitLab. So I want to show off the cool GitHub one I've got, which is so this is GitHub's CI stuff. Basically, it lets you submit jobs to be running in the background. And this is a cool sort of dynamic use of matrix we're going to do here. So if I start off a CI job, and I kick that off, I go back to my operations room. In theory, if GitHub's going to talk to me, we've got this event here saying, hey, you just started a job. And you'll see here over time as things start completing, they'll start editing this event and give you like a status update. So now here it's now got a building process. And if you wait some number of seconds for my build to complete, you'll see that eventually it gives you a nice green check, assuming this is actually going to work for me. Of course, I've given it 30 seconds, so I'm going to keep talking for another 10 seconds. Otherwise, it'll take too long. But yeah, so generally this bridge supports lots of different protocols. So you've got also GitLab as well. I can also show off the fact that we have a GitLab here. So it supports a bunch of things such as choosing what event sheets you want to handle and things like that. If I go back to my GitLab and I just sort of create a new test event, like, I don't know, tests. Go back to my room, you can see that, yeah, that totally happens. We can also see that my job has just finished, which is also cool. So essentially, anyway, it basically integrates a bunch of different services into Matrix. And if you look into any of these events, you'll see that there's preserved data for it. So you can find a good example of this. Here we go. So you can see here that actually Hookshot also preserves all the metadata of these events. So you can see that the GitHub issue, actually the matrix event itself contains the information from the GitHub issue. So you're not just sending a message to a room, you're also maintaining all that data. So essentially this bridge extracts data from GitHub and stores it within Matrix and sort of moves their data away from the closed silo into a public room that people can then use and hook off. So it's quite a cool tool for sort of open data extraction, if you would. So that's sort of the demo portion of it. So what's next for the project? We want to keep integrating services. Importantly, we want to have Git and Google Drive and many other services. We want to sort of pull that data into Hookshot and have that data available, and sort of just build up matrix rooms full of data, essentially making it an open format. We want to improve the widget interfaces. You saw a little bit of that interface from earlier with the sort of Hookshot and GitLab support. We want to keep going there and add more features and just less requirement, but less need for the command-based interfaces. One of the things we'll do at Element is reduce the need for random users to start having to type commands in to make their bridges work. We want it to all be a sort of organic, and you can just press buttons to get things to work. Obviously, with like end-to-end encryption, just because it'd be good to have that going. That's coming soon. And then finally, once all this work gets done, we'd like to make it more scalable again, because we're expecting more and more people to start using this thing. So how to get involved? We have a Hookshot GitHub repo. We'd love to see more people working on that. We've got a small community, but it's growing, which is nice to see, but always good to see more people getting involved there. We also have a matrix room, obviously, which you can come chat to us in. But other than that, that is everything to talk about Hookshot.
Thank you. I particularly like the Hookshot project because it's really a way to make use of open standards and open API to funnel all the things in a single place, which is particularly useful. If I were in an ops team, I would definitely take a good look at Hookshot because you can have everything you are interacting with usually in a single place. For example, you have been making a demo of the GitLab and GitHub bridges, which are part of Hookshot. It really solves the problem of having the conversations scattered all around the place that we all know is happening sometimes. The bridges you have been demonstrating, they are based on open APIs. It's a good thing. They don't have to be difficult to set up, and you can pull data from those APIs and funnel all that in a single room for a human to be able to get all the information in a single place. But with that said, Element is offering bridges to WhatsApp or Signal, for example, who are explicitly not using open standards or on purpose. You still manage to bridge to them. Do you have any interest in third-party providing open APIs at all, or are you happy with how things are right now?
I think what Element do and what makes us as the wide community is we try to make these things open forcibly, basically. Bridges are there to forcibly open closed silos. They're not here to give Facebook and WhatsApp more numbers for their users. We're there to pull that data out forcibly and getting behind things. But of course, we would like a world where all this data is open. We'd like it if the hard work wasn't trying to convince Facebook to give us their messages. We'd like it if we didn't have to spend hours trying to reverse engineer clients, and it could instead just try and improve the software we're currently meant to be writing. So from my point of view, absolutely, we want these third-party open APIs to exist, as in we want this data to be freely accessible, not forcibly, removed from their clients.
So another danger is that you are not doing scraping, you're reverse engineering the APIs, but nothing is telling you that it's not going to change in the future. So you need to be super wary about what's happening on the side of the provider. So open APIs, which are a form of open standard, would be truly useful for that. We have seen that people who want to rely on Openstreetmap need to either find a commercial type server or host their own. They cannot use the OSM resources for free without the limits. You are on the other side of the fence. How do things look like from your window when you are bridging to a new service? Is there more than technical issues to it? I'm thinking in particular of rate limiting or agreements on fair use.
We'd like to have that discussion, I think, is the problem at the moment. We're finding that because most companies don't want to talk about even interoperability at all, you can't have a discussion about rate limiting. Of course, bridging has to be sensible. We have to have rate limits in place. We don't want to be a vector to somebody else's network and cause spam by having Matrix throw a lot in. So it's like the forefront of our bridge development is making sure that what we're bridging into networks is reasonable and human interactions, importantly, and they're not all just lots of spam traffic from bots. That's very important to us. At the same time, right now it's very difficult to even have that discussion with providers because they're not interested. Talking particularly about the WhatsApp signal side of things, other providers like RSC and Libero, we have great relations with, and it's all very easily agreed about how much traffic we bridge and who's responsible for spam and things like that. But for providers which don't have any formal policy, and yet, as you said, scraping, we would like to have those discussions about, how can we make both the networks benefit from the bridging. So that'd be a good thing to think about. Agreements on fair use is something we should have. It should be between any two networks. There should be an agreement about what's fair.
So what you're telling me is that you are not trying to be a freeloader on the third-party services. You would like actually to be able to do some mitigation issues if they feel like you are consuming too much bandwidth or making too many calls to their APIs?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if someone on the stream tomorrow and said, oh, you're using too much APIs, I'd be over the moon to say, well, let's see how we can make this better. How can we improve it? Right now, it's such a black box. I think, generally speaking, Matrix exists to be, we are sort of a fabric between services. That's one of our goals, both federation and also bridging. I mean, the ultimate goal to providers is to have them federate to us. In an ideal world, bridges wouldn't exist. Everyone would be talking federation. WhatsApp, Google, or whoever would be talking to us through Matrix APIs, and then they would have the full control over how much data they send, how much they receive. The best case is that my job ceased to exist, and suddenly there are just people writing their own, federation APIs into things. Right now, you've got this sort of awkward bit in the middle where we have to try and make everybody happy with bridges.
Right. I don't know if you have a demo ready for that, but I once was shown a very interesting feature of Hookshot, which was discussions happening in GitHub that were bridged to Matrix. If you don't have a demo, can you tell us a bit more about...
I do have a demo. I tested it before we did the call. So I was like, I bet he's going to ask about this.
You do have a demo?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Let's see if I can find it. Hang on. That room. So yeah, I just share my screen, and I go to. So we have a space, we have a space which shows my internal GitHub chat room project, and you can see here that we've got one conversation going on already, this is our so I should say Matrix as a concept of space, which is basically groups of rooms. So if I go over to my chat room discussion and I create a new discussion, and let's just say hello, and let's make this a poll. Right, that's too complicated. Let's do a show and tell. And we start discussion here. This all comes through nice and easily. And if we go back to this client and I have to refresh this, you'll see here we've got this OTWSU, which is awesome. We join this discussion here. We can go and say, hello from Matrix. And you can see here that obviously my message from Matrix just appeared on the client. If I go and say hello back, it'll be really hard to tell because we also bridge the avatars, but so you can see here, you've got all the content from your discussion appearing here. And of course, you've got the hierarchy from the space. So one of the things I'd like to start actually doing is with Matrix replays where we have discussions, if we could just bridge all of those to Matrix as well. So, people on GitHub can be responded to immediately from Matrix clients and so on. So yeah, that feature all works perfectly fine.
Excellent. That's exactly what I had in mind when I said that if I were somebody from an ops team, I would definitely want to have such a tool, because conversations scattered all around the place is something terrible. You lose information, you don't get notified about things, and it's terrible when it happens. If we can sidetrack bits, do you have a spanner widget at hand? Because it's another thing. It's not related to bridges and open standards at all, but I want you to show that to the world. It's the
I might have it. I can see if I can find it.
I'd say it's the personification of keep it simple, stupid. It's something that's really simple but so useful. It's a widget you can add in a Matrix room. So let's say you can have, for example, a Hookshot that is forwarding events or bridging events to a single room where you have all your ops team. And then you can get somebody to grab the spanner or to release the spanner. I'm going to leave Hookshot. Sorry, it's difficult to say either Hookshot or Hookshot.
It's been a problem internally, don't worry.
Yeah.
So,
So
I can
the
demo this
spanner
one.
widget is so useful. You have it at hand?
I have it. Yep. So you'll see here, basically, this is a very simple thing. As been saying, but we have the concept of wanting to hold a lock on a resource. This thing having a lot internally, and it was really nice to suddenly get the ability to have a button you can click to say, I want to own the thing. So I have here the treats widget, and if you click through here and click take, suddenly you have, oh, you wait long enough for the thing to re-render and in my client to respond to it. There we go. You see that, I've got the treats, which basically means I control this resource. And then when I'm done with the thing, you click this, and then suddenly it drops the thing. And this is really useful because you basically can then pin this to your client. And so when you're working inside an ops team, you can click and take the thing and see who else has got the thing. And it's really useful for basically maintaining that people don't, write over each other's changes. We actually use this a lot inside Element between teams because when you're doing an async work, it's very useful to have the ability to do locks. So yeah, I've definitely got that demo.
Excellent, thanks. So if you had a magic wand and could do anything to make your bridgeman life easier, what would you do right now?
I'd walk into various major communication softwares offices and say, please federate to Matrix, and here's the standard. Can you start doing it, please? And that would be the one request. Because as soon as they start federating in, suddenly we just stop speaking 5 or 6 different APIs. We don't speak APIs at all. We simply handle traffic. And ultimately, this is what's happened with browsers, with email for years. We just want to be the same for instant messaging, really. I think it's a simple request. Make it happen, guys.
There is some lobbying going on at the EU level and some work by the Matrix team about the DMA. There were some fears about how DMA could weaken end-to-end encryption. Actually, there is an interoperable protocol that everybody can speak that is end-to-end encrypted, and that is Matrix. So we would like very much that to happen, that the gatekeepers, if they really care about end-to-end encryption, they can use Matrix and they don't have to break end-to-end encryption. There is a lot that was covered in a few blog posts. You can go to matrix.org if you want to have a full detailed explanation on our take on the subject. No, we do not want to weaken encryption. We do care about that. It's one of the key features of Matrix, as is interoperability. Hookshot, do you have any final thoughts you want to let us know about before we conclude the episode?
Keep using Matrix, guys, and also check out Hookshot, those sorts of things. Keep bridging, and that's it, really. Keep the world turning.
Thank you very much. So it was, I had very interesting discussions from my perspective with my guests. We had Italo from Libreoffice who told us about the open standards on how to store the files and why they matter and what bad can happen if you don't use open standards. We touched very briefly on how culture can get in the way, and that's quite a paradox for me. We then moved on to Openstreetmaps and the importance of open data as well, because open standards are good, but if you don't have anything to share, then they are not really useful. So open data is very useful and important as well, and you have many questions when you have open data, mostly on governance and managing abuse and resolving conflicts, because humans do love conflicts for some reason. And then we could see how to make good use of open standards, open APIs, and how to pool the data in a single place with Hookshot, which makes it very useful in practice for teams. It was a real pleasure to have all my guests this evening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I wish you a good evening or a good day if you are on another time zone than me or watching this later. And I'll see you next month for another episode of Open Tech Will Save Us. See you around.
Thank you.